Now the end is near.
I shall be moving on soon, so I want to ask you a favour.
Name it.
Don't make the same mistake that me and my brothers have done.
If you lads pull this off, you're going to go down in history.
Goodbye to you, my trusted friend.
Where's that? Sunderland.
Each other since we were 9 or 10.
You're talking about the post office, aren't you? How much we're looking at? Maybe more.
Learned of love and hate.
Any news on Stephen Sayers?
Word on the street is he's headed to the Costas.
We're a long way from York Street now, mate. This deal, it's the start of the big thing. We're a new breed of criminal.
You tried to teach me right from wrong.
There's only one way that this is going to go, Stephen. In any happy ending for the life you three have chosen. Please think about him.
By my friend, it's hard to die.
Or me.
They're a family of West Enders who think they run Newcastle. They're a couple of jumped up, jacked the lads out of their depth.
Stephen has been a while.
They think they're big fish in a little pond. And it's my pond.
Mr. Stephen Sayers, I'm arresting you on suspicion of armed robbery. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you.
You can't beat the system. If you try, well, I'll just lock you up.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in the sun. But the hills that we climbed were just seasons at a time. We had joy, we had fun,
And if you try,
seasons in the sun. But the hills that we climbed were
they'll throw away the key.
Please pray for me.
Critics attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true.
And it feels alright when they come and say to you.
Good morning, welcome along to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. Ben is running another couple of minutes late, so he should be joining us to look back. Yesterday's entertaining 2-2 draw at Elland Road. Probably feel personally that Newcastle United should really have taken all 3 points yesterday, but you've got to be sensible when you look at a game like that. Leeds are fighting for their lives. Newcastle, of course, pushing for the Champions League places, trying to get it over the line, if you like. And unfortunately, Leeds' high press and defensive attitude to yesterday's game led to Newcastle United only getting a point. But it's a point towards Champions League qualification. I think we need to be positive. For me personally, I think the positive things to come out of yesterday's game were Nick Pope's performance. Penalty save was superb. The follow-up save just as important. And ultimately, Callum Wilson proving that under pressure, when you have to step up and take a penalty, not once, but twice in a game. He's got the mindset, he's got the capability of doing that. And in a crucial game, a big game like that, in a crucial stage of the game, to put the ball in the back of the net, not once, but twice against a hostile crowd, for me was absolutely brilliant. Really, really good. I think the downside of yesterday, of course, was that Manchester United won, put the pressure on us. You would imagine that Liverpool are probably going to go on and win again. It's going to be tight going into the final 3 matches. The positives for me, Newcastle United have got essentially 2 home games, and they've got to be able to take those opportunities. But enough from me. Bringing in Ben now. Good morning, Ben. How are you, mate?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
All good, mate. Good to see you. And before we start talking football, mate, I am going to take Tom Dixon's question, which is quite a serious issue, Ben. Ben, do you think there should be more tight security with how getting attacked yesterday? I mean, unsavoury scenes. It could have been a lot worse, that, Ben. In this day and age, we know that, there are sadly people out there who go to matches, with an intent and causing trouble. Some can be armed. We saw a guy, of course, tie himself to the post at Everton last year in a Newcastle fixture, was handed a knife by somebody in the crowd to cut the cable ties off. I mean, Eddie Howe can count yourself very lucky yesterday. Leeds, of course, acted swiftly. The guy was arrested and escorted out of the ground. Predominantly was captured by Newcastle security team, not by Leeds' security team, which is a bit of a worry. But has subsequently been banned, lifetime ban, from Leeds United. I still think the club will face some kind of investigation by the FA, but that was a serious issue, Ben.
Really serious issue, and ultimately there's 2 parts to it. One is what you do afterwards, and 2 is what you learn from it to try and prevent it happening in the first place. And I've never bought this argument that the incidents are too few and far between to be taking more preemptive measures. So of course what you can do is you can try and provide the deterrent of saying to fans, if you enter the field, or in this case, if you approach a manager or player, then you're going to get a life ban. And you can put in place cameras. Tottenham are very good at that. One of the advantages of having such a world-class stadium is that there's cameras available to pretty much zoom in on every single seat. So in retrospect, you can be reactive and you can find out who the culprit is. And all of that, I think, generally is done very well in terms of using technology now to find the culprit, and in this case, arrest the culprit and ban the culprit. And that is a deterrent to some extent. But we're still, I think, a little bit lax in the preemptive part, which is really important, because if we consistently think we're okay with deterrence and police presence and cameras, then what you're going to find, because football is a passionate game and because the idiots doing these kind of things are ultimately prepared to try new things and try and get around the technology, and fans are often familiar with their own stadiums and they're often aware of where they can sit to get that type of access. So it can be quite challenging. And in the end, you have a scenario where you might have to put a net around the area where the dugout is, or you might need stronger police presence, or you might need fans that are more distant from the track or the dugout around the football field. And all of these things are disappointing, because what you're doing is reacting to one stupid individual or a series of idiots. And in doing so, you are having to change the look and feel of your stadium and make it less claustrophobic and bring fans further away from the action. But this is something that may need to be considered. Obviously, if you look at US sport for very different reasons, for a different kind of safety, particularly in baseball, there's a net behind where the pitcher is throwing to and the home plate, because obviously the ball can go backwards and it protects the people directly behind where the ball's being thrown. We don't want that in football. We've seen that in the past in certain stadiums around Europe, but something has to be done here, because, as you rightly say, Eddie Howe had no idea who that person was, whether it was going to be verbal abuse, whether it was going to be physical abuse. And as soon as any individual can get to a manager, that easily, in some ways it doesn't matter in that context that afterwards they're arrested and they're punished, because that's what you expect. And the authorities did act swiftly. But that doesn't mean that someone else doesn't look at that and say, well, I'm prepared to be arrested the next time and I'll confront a manager. So how do we stop it beforehand rather than just provide a punishment and a deterrent afterwards? And that's the bit where we need more work, because we don't want to have to change that area significantly to the point where every fan in and around the dugout feels they've got a restricted view, feels they've got a net in front of them, feels they've got police in front of them. But something has to be done, because it was all too easy for that fan to get to Eddie Howe. And the next time some idiot decides to do that, what if it isn't verbal abuse? What if they try and take a swing at them? What if they're carrying some kind of weapon? And I think that it isn't only about the police presence, it's also about ensuring that every single fan coming into the stadium, in essence, becomes more known and accountable. So it's taking that aspect that we're lacking on social media, which is the faceless person or fan shouting and screaming and thinking they can get away with it. And then in football stadiums, there's still that element of anonymity, because people chant collectively, people abuse collectively, and traditionally people have not felt like they're going to get called out. So there becomes more of a responsibility on the clubs and the stewards to know who these people are, whether that's because when you scan in, it has to correlate name to ID, or whether that's because you come regularly and as a consequence, the stewards and the police realize who you are. And when they see somebody different in their area, they take the time to speak to them and get to know them. There's no one size fits all solution, but the point I'm making is if we only think about reacting to it, if we only think about adapting afterwards, and if we only think about punishments and deterrence, that is all reactive measures. And we have to find a way to be more proactive and preemptive to ensure that it becomes impossible for this to happen rather than possible for it to happen, and then firm reactions afterwards.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There's no place for it in football. I know Steve says I think the media are making too much of it, name and shame him, ban him for life, which is what's happened. He's been, banned for life. Stewards should have been more aware. Yeah, the stewards will get the wrist slapped for that. There's no doubt about it. I mean, yeah, and I get the point. Yeah, nothing serious happened to Eddie Howe, but it's something serious could have happened to him. A lot of people in the chat talking about it. Let's talk about football. What did you make of the game yesterday? Have you had time to catch up with the full game, or have you watched highlights? What was your thoughts on the game yesterday?
Yeah, I watched the game. I thought that it was one of Newcastle's worst performances of the season. In many ways, lucky to come away with something from the game. Of course, when Leeds were leading, there was the missed penalty, and that could have been significant. And it was a strange kind of game that had ebbs and flows and a bit of everything. And on the one hand, you can say Newcastle scored 2 penalties and ended up leading a game against a struggling team with 20 minutes remaining. So the fact that Leeds equalised with about 10 minutes to go is disappointing. But I think when you actually look at the game, Newcastle didn't do enough from open play. And as a result, I think that they were quite fortunate in many ways to come away with Ellen Road for a point. Yet they had the lion's share of the possession. Yes, they had almost double the shots of Leeds United, but I just felt they lacked a bit of a cutting edge from open play. And without the penalties, I'm not sure that they would have got anything from the game. So Leeds will be happy enough with a point because it keeps them ticking along, but they'll also be disappointed because they'll know they caught Newcastle on a bit of an off day. And from Newcastle's perspective, the point as to whether it's good or bad will only really be apparent at the end of the season. It looks like drop points because Manchester United beat Wolves, and if Liverpool beat my team Leicester, then suddenly there'll be a little bit of panic and trepidation heading into the end of the season. But Newcastle could also qualify for Champions League football come the end of the season by just a single point, and then suddenly we'll be looking back on this game and saying, phew, it's lucky that Leeds didn't double their lead with the missed penalty. And it's fortunate that Newcastle were able to almost grind out a point away from home in a game where they just weren't at their most fluid or best. So I thought it was fantastic entertainment if you were a neutral, but I think that it was a bit of a wobble from Newcastle, and it was lucky in the end that from the penalty spot, Callum Wilson was clinical.
David Link says he's a Leeds fan. We should have lost. We were rubbish. We always rely on Bamford. I thought Leeds played well, better than I've seen them play in recent weeks. I take, it's all about opinions. You think it was one of Newcastle's worst performances. I think we've got to give Leeds credit. I thought Leeds high pressed. I thought they defended in numbers. They made it difficult whenever Newcastle got the ball. They surrounded us. Again, I thought the draw was a fair result. I do feel, though, that, again, 2 weeks in a row now, referees seem to be, I don't know why, but they don't make an early stance now, Ben. In the old days, if somebody was time wasting, like last week, or if someone was persistently fouling, a yellow card early puts an end to it. I feel now that referees are hanging back. They're not punishing things as they should have been. I don't know whether this is some kind of guidance, try and give people the benefit of the doubt, whatever, I really don't know. But there was no yellow cards for a considerable amount of time last week, and the same again this week. And that's happened throughout the season. And then suddenly we get a yellow card for something which is fairly innocuous. And I think it sometimes spoils the flow of a game when the referee doesn't stamp his authority early on. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that VAR makes referees hesitant generally. And obviously, if you're giving a yellow card, it shouldn't have any type of impact, really, because that's just about setting out an agenda and making sure that a game has discipline. It's not really a necessity to involve technology in that. And clearly, if you give a yellow card and then VAR wants to look at it to upgrade it to a red, that's a little bit different. But when you're just talking about cynical fouls, when you're just talking about early fouls to break up the rhythm of the game or add a little bit of fieriness to things, that's when a referee would traditionally whip out a card as if to say, I'm having none of this. And that aspect has, to an extent, gone from the game. And I don't know whether at the back of a referee's mind is just the fact that there's another person watching and they don't want to give too many early cards because they know that more might come and suddenly you've ruined a game. But I've always found that aspect strange, and I agree with you as a result, because it's not about ruining a game from a referee's point of view. It's about refereeing a game. It's players ruining games. So if the referee has to give 2 legit yellow cards and one of them came really early, and then as a result, an hour later, the player's off, that's not the referee ruin the game. That's the referee did his job and a player made 2 stupid challenges or offences. So 2 yellow cards had to be given. And the whole point of technology is we're supposed to have that safety net now to the point where less mistakes are made. But it feels like since VAR has been introduced, referees generally are more hesitant to waive an early card or to give any kind of decision because they know that they've always got to let play run on, and then they've always got the ability for VAR to intercede. And that's taking a lot of the power and control away from the referee in many ways. So I think that you can understand why a Leeds United side would ultimately want to break up Newcastle's rhythm. They would want to make it very difficult for Newcastle to play through wide areas. They would want to make sure that Newcastle can't switch the direction of play. So you start breaking things up. You start tugging players. You start standing on people. You start blocking people. But obviously, if you're allowed to do that in the first 20, 30 minutes without any kind of punishment, you're just going to keep doing it. And you absolutely can't blame any player for that because it's part and parcel of the game. And it's really interesting how we look at these fouls in football compared to other sports. Because if you take basketball, for example, there is an agreed amount of fouls allowed. So when you foul, it's part of the game and you're doing it intentionally. You're saying, I'm going to tug you back because I know you were going to score then. And it's fine because we've got 5 fouls before we go into the penalty. And obviously football could never do that. It'd be absolutely daft to introduce something like that. But it is just interesting that a cynical foul in basketball is just well played. We had a foul to give. So of course we gave the foul. Whereas in football, it's a cynical foul. And it's how have you got away with that? You just stopped us doing something. You did it intentionally. You should be yellow carded or red carded. And because of that difference, the referee has to clearly understand in his or her mind that a foul is not part of the game. A foul is not something that you can just give for the sake of it. There is such thing as a smart foul, but there's always that danger of punishment. And if the referee early on fails to give that punishment, it invites the whole team to then say, he didn't get booked for that. That's the yardstick. Or he did get booked for that. That's the yardstick, which is why it's important that the officials are told that part of the consistency isn't just letting the game flow and isn't just relying on VAR for the big decisions. Part of the consistency is about individual referees making sure that they keep control of the game and they don't allow teams to play in a way that intentionally kicks and tugs and pulls and has infractions or even time wastes at the back end of the game, and you just get away with it. And I do think we're seeing more of that for some reason since technology has been introduced.
Yeah, I mean, the loads of controversial issues. Kenny's going, should the player who handled the ball in the box for the penalty be given the yellow card? My answer to that was yes. And the first yellow card, which Paul Watson mentions, was Bruno, who'd been persistently fouled all game by Leeds and then was yellow carded for diving. I mean, it does beg a belief. Every referee's different. Every game's different. And I guess the get-out clause for referees, Ben, is referees are only human. And they go into a game sometimes with a mindset of how they're gonna manage a particular game, and sometimes they get it wrong.
Well, sometimes they get it wrong, but sometimes there's no excuse simply because you have technology. You don't just have a referee; you have a fourth official and 2 assistants. So when you look at Bruno, I have no problem with him being booked for diving simply because that is basically a letter of the law. It's not only about wider context with that kind of thing. So if you have a tackle from behind, for example, and it's given as a yellow, and then someone does exactly the same kind of tackle from behind and it's not given as a yellow, you turn to the referee and say those were like for like. But if a player dives, a player dives. And if the referee thinks the player's dived, we can debate whether or not it was a dive. But if the referee's perspective is he dived, then he has to whip out a yellow card. But where I think there's a problem is more around policing earlier in the game on other incidents. Like you look at Firpo, who was eventually sent off, and the wild tackle on Bruno, and that was only a yellow card. And for me, that's a red all day long. And obviously, if he gets sent off a little bit earlier in the game, then it once again changes the complexion of the game. So that's more my issue, that when you have a scenario where there might be a wild tackle, you start to think, who can judge that? Well, the referee can, the assistants can, the fourth official can, and VAR can. And still they come together. And in my opinion, maybe others disagree, it was the wrong decision. That was a red card all day long. So eventually he goes off. But by the time that sending off happens, I think it was 1 minute into added time. So it was always less likely that there was going to be a possibility that Newcastle could go on and get a winner and take advantage of the 10 men. So that's more my issue. I think if you're comparing why wasn't someone booked for something else versus why was Bruno booked for diving, it's less of a helpful comparison because one has just got clear guidance. If the ref thinks the player's simulated, then he's going to whip out his yellow card, and he's going to do that regardless of wider context in the game. But I'm just still completely baffled as to why you got ref, you got assistants, you got fourth official, you got VAR, and you see that wild tackle on Bruno and it's only a yellow. And where's the kind of ability for, once again, throughout the course of the game, that referee to gain back control and make a primary decision? And I think this is where I'd like to see VAR adapt, not just in the context of that one incident, but a bit more broadly. Because if you allow the referee to go to the monitor, and we all know that in the long term, it's going to end up being something on a watch or something in his pocket on an iPad to speed it all up. And I know from working in TV, when we get match footage coming in and we want a replay, there's a little circular button that we press and you just turn it back and you get the last 30 seconds of the game within a fraction of a second. So it'd be very easy for a referee to have something in his pocket or to be passed something really quickly and literally just have the clip ready and watch it. And there's no reason, I think, if there's speed to it, why that can't happen 6, 7, 8 times in a game. And sometimes the ref, in fairness, goes to the monitor. So I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. But at the moment, we have VAR making a recommendation and the referee either buying it because he's told it's clear cut, or sometimes going to the monitor. But it still means that the referee has this all-encompassing, all-powerful VAR room above him. And if they say we've seen the footage and we think X, 9 times out of 10, the referee just goes yes. Whereas VAR could just be a technology room, and it could just be the people that show you the replays, and it still could be one individual looking at that replay and deciding it. So I still don't like the idea that power is being taken away from the ref. I prefer the idea, just my personal opinion, that a ref is part of the game, and you can have different personalities and you can have different levels of strictness. You look at baseball and the umpire, every umpire has a slightly different strike zone. But in football, as long as your ref is seeing the same footage, let them predominantly make the decisions when it's necessary to see that footage. And they might interpret that footage differently, but they're the referee. They're entitled to do that. I like the fact that the referee is a human. I like the fact that every referee has a slightly different reading of the game. But the technology is there to add consistency. But that doesn't mean that the individual in the middle can't still whip out something, look at things more often, and still be the final decision maker. At the moment, they're a bit redundant in the middle there. You may as well just have some kind of electronic car going up and down the field and making an alert every time there's an offside or there's a problem, because the ref's not doing that much except speaking to the players every so often, because they know for all the big decisions, there's another ref and there's a bunch of technology above them. And I still think we've got a little bit of a disconnect there. So more power is needed back to the man or woman in the middle, in my opinion. Maybe others disagree, but in getting that more power, they have to consistently watch a bit more footage as well. Otherwise, the technology becomes redundant.
Yeah, it's a talking point which we'll always have. Unfortunately, referees are part of the game, and ultimately for me, it balances us out. I know it's a phrase that a lot of football fans hate, including Newcastle fans. Dare say Leicester fans as well, but it balances itself out over the season. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that, but that is the way it goes. Okay, we're halfway through the show. Time for the quick ad break. A big shout out to all our sponsors. Thanks to Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay as you go waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces, handmade in Cumbria. You can order them from their website, mrvickies.co.uk, or by calling 01768 210 102. Thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the video technology. Thanks to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle. If you enjoy the show, please hit the little thumb under the video and like the video. Click share to share to your other social media, or subscribe. It's free, and we do 7 shows a week. If you want to become a member, you can click join underneath this video. There are different packages to suit all different pockets. And if you want to become a cult member, then put your smartphone over the QR code. It'll take you straight there to the website, which is NUFCmatters.com. If you go in via the website, just click membership pack. What do you get for your money? You get a pen, you get a cup, get a membership card and a scarf, and entry into the monthly draw. Don't forget, we are available as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. And we also support the food bank on this show. NUFCfansfoodbank.co.uk is where you'll find the matchday bucket. You can make a virtual donation today. We've also got some events coming up over the next couple of months. An evening with Peter Beardsley at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets available from newcastlelegends.com, or go to Voucher and get a 40% discount. Our end of season do is the 27th of May at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets are a tenner from nufcmatters.com. An evening with Gavin Peacock takes place on July the 10th at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets from nufcmatters.com for that event. And the following night, Gavin will be at the Tynemouth Surf Cafe. Go to their website for ticket information. We've got a vast range of t-shirts, merchandise and memorabilia available at our website. The Isaac t-shirt is doing well. Go to nufcmatters.com to buy one today. Roger says, can a ref choose to not look at the video, Ben?
I mean, they'd be nuts to if they're recommended that they need to, but in theory, the referee has autonomy. So if they decide to make a decision and VAR say, you should take another look at that, and the referee says, no, I'm absolutely convinced I got a better view, I got a better angle, then that would be possible. But I think that the referees committee would probably go to that ref afterwards and say, we asked you to look at it. Why didn't you? You didn't act in a way where you showed due diligence. So technically, ref can do what they want. They don't have to go to the monitor, but they are advised to go to the monitor. And I don't think you'd find a ref out there that would not follow that advice, because ultimately there's somebody in the VAR room that has seen a different angle and a different perspective. And if they're telling the referee there's something you've not seen, and then the referee says, I don't care, I don't want to look at the monitor, then that's not really acting in a thorough enough manner or with correct integrity. So the answer to your question is, yeah, the ref can do what they want, but you won't find a ref that's trained to ignore the little birdie in their ear in the VAR room if they tell them they have to go to the monitor.
Tom, asking about a potential transfer, a name we've been linked with on numerous occasions. Ben, any updates on that one?
Nothing at this point, really. As you say, Newcastle have been linked for quite some time, and there is probably a situation arising now where there's 6 or 7 suitors in the mix, and as a consequence, things are starting to heat up. And I would be quite cautious, therefore, because there's a lot of kind of competitive tension being generated at this point, both on the agent side and also more broadly as well. And what we know is that Newcastle have looked before, and we also know that they're well aware of Thuram's situation. And the France international is entering the final 2 years of his contract at Nice, who do feel like a summer sale will happen, and they're open to that. I think what's put off Newcastle in the past is probably that the price Nice were asking for was deemed to be too high, something in the region of 55 or 60 million pounds, and Newcastle's valuation was significantly lower than that. So it's very similar to Maddison last summer. Newcastle were bidding 40 to 45 million, and Leicester were saying it's 60 plus million, and Newcastle walked away. So at the moment, there is nothing concrete, but we'll wait and see. First of all, Newcastle have to make Champions League football. Then they have to determine whether or not they have that kind of budget. And then on top of that, they have to establish what kind of player they're going to put that budget on, because it's not going to be a 300 plus million type window for Newcastle just because they make Champions League football. They've still got to abide by financial fair play. And they're still aware that even with European football, they might not have it season after season after season. It's looking like that. The project is ambitious. It's heading in that direction. But until you have it 3, 4, 5 years in a row, you don't pre-budget for it, because that's nuts. Otherwise, you're overpaying, you're overspending, your wage bill increases. And if after a season, Newcastle don't have it again, then they're stuck with a bunch of players that they've paid a big amount for, that they've ultimately increased their wage structure for, and suddenly you're 10th in the table. And that's how you get into financial problems. So I think we have to be very wary at the moment. But what we know is that Eddie Howe is really keen on signing a deeper lying midfielder. And Declan Rice is another one of those names, of course. And I think that with Rice, it's more likely Arsenal will be the preference. We can't rule out Chelsea either, but a London stay is something that Rice would like in an ideal world. And the other thing, of course, is that West Ham are pushing this inflated price tag now of a British record, something in the region of 105 million all the way through to 120 million. And Newcastle are not going to be in the conversation to spend that type of money, again, because of financial fair play. So nothing concrete at the moment with Thuram. And in terms also of the older brother, Marcus, that's another one that Newcastle have been linked with in the past. There's nothing in that one at the moment either. But the big difference between the two brothers is that the older brother is set to leave Borussia Mönchengladbach on a free this summer. So there is value there. And I think that we'll still see Newcastle go down that line. Who's available at value? Who's available at a cut price deal? who's available where they don't have to break their wage structure or their budget, which is why Maddison's still really interesting, because if Leicester go down, I hate to say it, but they'll have to offload him. They'll need the money. They'll want him off the wage bill. The player's not going to be ambling around in the Championship trying to get Leicester back up. So suddenly that 60 million last summer goes down a little bit, and there becomes value in the deal. And Maddison at 50 million, or the 45 million that Newcastle offered last summer, is a tremendous bit of business in the current market. So that's where there might be a window of opportunity. And with Maddison, I'm sure there's questions about him as well. Newcastle need Champions League football, and they have to act fast. And if they do so, Spurs may not have a manager in place. Spurs may not have a sporting director in place, and Newcastle can use that to their advantage. So Maddison will want to leave Leicester, even if they stay up, I think, but definitely if they go down. And Newcastle are still, as they have been for the best part of a year, a very serious suitor.
Yeah. Okay. Bruno, has he signed a new contract? I don't think so. There's a lot of talk about him extending his contract. So it's an easy answer to that one. Let's go back to tomorrow's game, because John's asked a question about tomorrow. Not one to usually question Eddie's tactics, but do you lads think it was the right move to bring ASM and Gordon on when we went 2-1 up? I think we should have tightened up and hung on for the 3 points. It's interesting because it's not within Eddie's mindset, I think, with his team. He likes the high press. He likes to put teams under pressure. He likes to go for it away from home. I would have kept Callum Wilson on the pitch and potentially took Isak off. That's what I would have done yesterday. But I'm not a manager. I'm a fan. I'm somebody who can have an opinion. I felt Callum Wilson yesterday was up for it. I thought he led the line, held the line well. I thought he gave Leeds a torrid time at the back. And I thought he was up for the game. And those 2 penalties, the pressure penalties, and there were pressure penalties, that second one in particular, where, you know, the goalkeeper tried his damnedest to put Callum Wilson off. It showed the quality of Wilson. And when we keep him fit, he is, you know, he's a worthy wearer of the number 9 shirt. But I agree with where you're coming from, John. I think there's so much that we could say about it. But look, we've got to point out the game. We're massively missing Longstaff. And I'm going to ask, I'll ask another question to you. You can answer John's, but I'll ask another question to you. Would you be surprised if at the end of the season we hear that Bruno's had an operation?
No, I wouldn't be surprised at all. But ultimately, it's not necessarily about him and that so much as just Newcastle in the first half of the season were all about clean sheets. And they were also all about the Miguel Almiron goals. And in the second half of the season, they're not keeping as many clean sheets and Almiron's not scoring as many goals. And luckily, Callum Wilson stepped up and Alexander Isak stepped up. So there's not really been a drought, but Almiron's not quite the same player as he was in the first half of the season, which I think is to be expected. He's not had a dreadful second half of the season, but he was on fire. He was scoring in every single game. He was guaranteed or near guaranteed to get you something in a game. And I think that's been a factor. And then with Bruno, I think that he's asked to play in many ways in a variety of different roles and positions. And that's because sometimes he's in the midfield with Joe Linton, and sometimes this season Joe Linton's played in a more advanced position. Sometimes Bruno's asked to be deep lying and shore things up, and sometimes he's expected to get box to box and chip in with goals. And that's been a factor, I think, to an extent in some games to how he's performed. And I never watch Bruno and think he has a terrible game, but sometimes I watch Bruno and think that the game management is off. And it comes back to what I've said before, which is when he joined, I felt he'd need time to adapt to the Premier League. And I was wrong because he just hit the ground running. I said the same about Sven Botman as well. But what you see is sometimes a new scenario presents itself that either Bruno or Newcastle players haven't been in before, because obviously they were all fighting relegation. And now they're in a position where they're challenging for top 4. They've not been in these scenarios before. First half of the season, they were leading games, keeping clean sheets. Second half of the season, they've had to come from behind at times. And when the pressure's on, you start to learn who can be a leader, who can offer calmness, who can rein it in, who can realize that the game management requires you to adapt, and who's got one way of playing. And I think that Bruno's so pivotal to Newcastle. He's right there in the middle of the park. He's playing in a 3, and that 3 sometimes change, and the game management scenario changes. And that's been a factor in all of this in terms of the consistency of performances and how he acts. Operation-wise, we'll wait and see. Contract-wise, I think regardless of what happens, Newcastle see Bruno as untouchable. So I don't see a scenario where anybody can sign him this summer still. And then the last thing on the sort of selection, which was the other question, is just the Howe mentality is to go out there and get a third goal and put the game to bed. And that's not to be reckless or gung-ho, but remember, the way that Leeds play, they're quite open, and everyone knows that 2-1 down, they're going to throw things at the game to try and find an equaliser. And they did, and all credit to them. And in hindsight, it's very easy to say that Newcastle should have been more rigid and disciplined and defensive-minded. But if they'd have ultimately managed to use the fresh legs of ASM and Gordon to grab a third goal in a very open end-to-end game, then everyone would have said that's brilliant from Howe. He's defending through attack. He's making sure that his fresh legs press. He's taking the ball off Leeds. He knows that they're going to be more expansive, and he's punished them going the other way. And that's what Howe does. So this was an unfortunate scenario where Leeds got an equaliser. It's very easy to say that defensive-minded changes, a switch in formation anyway, should have been made. But if you look at the whole season, Howe's generally got his substitutions right. And maybe a Jacob Murphy could have come on, who gives you something a little bit different, in my opinion, and is quite versatile and can be given a game management plan and can execute it. But beyond that, there'd be no point, in my opinion, in bringing on Manquillo or Matt Targett, because the back 4 and the midfield were doing absolutely fine, in my opinion. So I can understand why the fresh legs came on. Maybe Wilson was struggling towards the end of the game as well. We don't really know. But I think if we're questioning one thing, for me, tactically, it's still a broader point for next season. I mean, it's not a criticism, because I think you had to try it and it's worked in many games. But how does Wilson and Isak coexist is the big thing for me, because I much prefer Isak leading the line centrally, but Callum Wilson leads the line centrally. So then if you're going to stick with a 4-3-3, then Isak's going to likely be on the left-hand side of a forward line. And how wide does he play? And how does, as I said before, he play alongside Wilson or in a front 3 with Wilson? If you stick with that 4-3-3, then let's just say it's Almiron on the other side. And that might work for Newcastle. But obviously, Joe Linton liked that more advanced role as well. And Bruno likes to get box to box. So is 4-3-3 the right formation for Newcastle if you decide that Wilson and Isak are your automatic starters? Or over time, does Isak come in place of Wilson, and then you've got more traditional wide forwards either side of them? And I think that's the big debate. And I don't know what the answer is, but I just feel that Isak is underutilized in terms of his strengths, playing out wide comparative to playing where Wilson's playing. So it's either a formation change, 4-4-2 perhaps, or it's one or the other for me.
Too late to start messing around with formations for me. I think Newcastle will keep it as it is. It's, somebody asked the question before, are we going, it was Kenny, have we hit a poor run of form at the wrong time? Well, we've won 3 games. We've lost against Arsenal, who are hopefully going for the title. And we've drawn against Leeds, who are fighting for their lives, Roger's asking, is our squad depth and strength now being tested? Which I get the question, Roger, but we were talking about this maybe 3 months ago after we'd lost the Carabao Cup. We've got, compared to Manchester United, we haven't got much strength and depth. But then for the last few weeks, when we've been winning games, everyone's been saying we've got strength and depth because we weren't playing Isak and Wilson together. We were bringing one on, and unfortunately, injuries do this to you. Longstaff has been a huge blow to Newcastle's last few games, losing Longstaff. And somebody asking, is Longstaff, it was Eamon McParland, I think, asking, have you got any idea, or any knowledge if Longstaff will be back or not this season? Eddie Howe said yes in the press conference, but there was no clarity as to when. You would imagine, hopefully, he could be fit for the Brighton or the Leicester game, I think.
Yeah, I think they were looking at the Leicester game, but it is a little bit unknown because it will just depend ultimately when he actually gets back into full training on grass, how he's able to recover and adapt. And it's the type of injury, unfortunately, that does have an element of the unknown. Unfortunately, the good news is that the scans showed that he had no broken bones, but the bad news is just that you got to be 100%. You can't be thrown in at this stage of the season and be 70, 80, 90%. And as a result, if there's any risk factor, he won't be back in the squad and involved. But Leicester, I think, is a possibility from what I understand. And then in terms of the poor form, I mean, they're not in poor form. It's as simple as that. Since March, they've pretty much won every game. The only two they've lost is Villa and Arsenal. And if they'd have beaten Leeds United, then people would still see that run as continuing because Arsenal are a top side and Villa were outstanding on the day. But since the win over Wolves, Newcastle have hit a brilliant run of form. And it just depends which way you look at the season, really, because remember, Newcastle had come from fighting relegation. So before a ball was kicked,
we've just qualified for Europe. We can't finish lower than 5th.
That's it. So it's Europa League football. And if you'd have offered that at the beginning of the season, people would have bitten your hand off and said, phenomenal, because Newcastle were fighting relegation the previous season. And the other thing as well is, let's not forget, beginning of the season, Newcastle were draw specialists. Apart from beating Forest in the opening game, and I think they lost to Liverpool, it was a series of draws and goals were hard to come by. And at that point, everyone thought this might be mid-table mediocrity. We might even go in the wrong direction. And then out of nowhere, really, they got these big wins. I think it was away at Fulham, and then they absolutely thrashed Brentford off the top of my head. And it sort of catalyzed a run of form where they just kept winning. And as I said earlier, not only kept winning, but kept clean sheets. I remember they got that narrow win over Everton at home. They thrashed Villa at home. They beat Chelsea just before the World Cup break at home. They comfortably won away at Leicester. And even when they were drawing, so going back a bit earlier, that Manchester United draw away from home, the Leeds draw at home, the Arsenal draw away, the win over Fulham, and I think it was Crystal Palace as well. Clean sheet, clean sheet, clean sheet, clean sheet. And that was probably until about mid-January. And it puts a bit of a false spin on the season in many ways because the clean sheets mean you don't need that many goals. And the run they went on from about October to mid-January was kind of different to the mood and complexion in that first 6-7 games of the season when everyone thought, hang on a minute. I remember coming on the show after the 0-0 draw. I think it was against Palace in September, and it was doom and gloom. It was, why are we not scoring goals? Why are we not offering anything? We're going to have a dreadful season. But because of that run between about October and January, everyone just went into this sort of beast mode mentality of, we don't concede, we score for fun. Almiron scores in every game. Botman won't concede anything. Our 11 picks itself. We're brilliant. We're going to somehow cruise into Champions League football. And I think the beginning of the season, in terms of the doom and gloom, was exaggerated. And the middle part of the season, in terms of unstoppable, was also exaggerated. And the reality, because Newcastle don't have the same depth, and because of the post-World Cup congested fixture calendar, the real reality is somewhere in the middle, that Newcastle on their day are unstoppable, but they don't have the same depth as a Liverpool or as a Manchester United who they're currently challenging with. So you are going to have the odd wobble. But if Newcastle's wobble in terms of now, between March the 12th, I think it was, and Leeds on May the 13th, so 3 months essentially, if Newcastle's wobble, having responded brilliantly after losing to Manchester City and Liverpool, if Newcastle's wobble is just losing 2 games and drawing 1 against Leeds and winning all the other games, again, off the top of my head, I don't know how many games it is, but it's got to be 8 at least wins. So that's 8 wins out of 11. If that's the wobble, then you take that every single season, because if you constantly win 8 out of 11, then you're always going to get Champions League football. So it's disappointing that they lost to Arsenal. It's disappointing that they weren't able to hang on against Leeds, but Champions League football is still very much in Newcastle's control. And because of the goal difference being better than Manchester United and Liverpool, I still think that 4 points might be enough. And obviously, if it's 2 wins, it will definitely be enough. So it's not easy fixtures for Newcastle, but I fancy them to get something at home to Brighton. I fancy them to beat Leicester. And therefore, away at Chelsea on the last game of the season, they'll either already be qualified for Champions League football or it will be in their hands.
Yeah. Okay. Some quick fire questions. Got 10 minutes left. Can Leicester get something tomorrow?
Tough, I think, because my sense is that Liverpool will win every game and they're flying at the moment. Leicester needs something. It's tricky for Liverpool. I remember when Leicester won the Premier League and they battered Liverpool. I think it was 4-0, and Vardy scored a goal pretty much from the halfway line on the half volley. They need that kind of performance. It's not unthinkable, a bit like Leeds yesterday, that Leicester get a point. Newcastle fans will be cheering for Leicester, obviously, because if Liverpool drop any points, it makes Newcastle's life a whole lot easier. But honestly, I fancy Liverpool to win.
Okay. You've already said you fancy Liverpool to win all their games. Do you think Manchester United will win all their games now?
No, I don't necessarily think that they will. And that's why I think that
Newcastle will get Champions League.
Yeah, but look, even if Liverpool win all of their remaining games, it doesn't mean that Liverpool will finish above Newcastle either, because Newcastle, in my opinion, will get something from Brighton, either a draw or a win. Let's say they beat Brighton, beat Leicester, and then I think off the top of my head, Liverpool can't catch Newcastle, so it's irrelevant.
No. Two wins, Newcastle's got Champions League. Simple as that. I mean, 2 home games.
I hate to say it, it's why I fear for Leicester, but I don't see Leicester getting anything at St James's Park. I think that 3 points is a near given. I'm pessimistic because I'm a Leicester fan, so we're always a little bit more cautious about thinking our team will pull something out the bag. But I think Newcastle win that game, and I think there's a very strong chance they beat Brighton as well. But if they get 4 points out of the next 2 games, then that takes them to 70 with a preferential goal difference. That means that Liverpool need to win all of their remaining games. I think they might. So that would be 71, which means that Newcastle would need a point at Chelsea on the final game of the season. I think they'll get that. And then they'd be ahead of Liverpool on goal difference. And then with Manchester United, I think it's quite an interesting run-in, because they, on paper, should beat Bournemouth, who have got nothing to play for. So that would be 3 points there. But they've been a little bit hit and miss away from home. They obviously lost to West Ham. They lost to Brighton. It's not easy playing a team that has got nothing to play for. But let's give them 3 points there. Then I think they might draw with Chelsea at home. And then, again, last game of the season at Fulham.
Liverpool's toughest game is Villa at home, because Unai Emery's got a good record against the teams above him. I genuinely think that's their hardest game.
Yeah, I think it's tricky for Manchester United. I think that they will go away at Bournemouth. That for me is 3 points. But as I say, Chelsea at home, very difficult. And then Fulham last game of the season. I'm not sure. What was your point about Villa?
Liverpool play Villa.
Yeah, I mean, Villa for me have had a great season, and they got an absolutely brilliant win against Tottenham, but they're away. That's the only thing about that last game, that second last game of the season. Like, Liverpool beat Southampton 100%. If they beat Leicester 100%. If it was away at Villa, I might think there's a problem here. But, Liverpool have got this bit between their teeth. They're looking at 3 cup finals. If they beat Leicester, knowing that last game against Southampton, I think, is a near given. I just think that they won't drop any points at home to Villa. It's their last home game of the season. I think there's 3 points. I honestly think that Liverpool will take 9 points from their last 3 games, which is worrying for Newcastle. But again, it's firmly in the hands of Newcastle United at the moment. There's a 4-point gap with only 3 games remaining. And at the moment, everyone's played an equal number of games. Newcastle have got a better goal difference as well. It's very hard to see Newcastle finishing outside the top 4.
Yeah, Geordie Tumberlake, there's only one answer to that question. Would rather be in Newcastle's position because they're in the lead at this moment in time and they've got a better goal difference and the win too, and they're into the Champions League. What the hell was Isaac doing passing to ASM when he could have scored himself and not been offside? Again, yesterday's game still frustrating a few people. A question for Ben, where does he think Osherman will end up?
At Napoli is the honest truth. I mean, we were over with CBS in Napoli when they won the league, and the Napoli president was clear that he doesn't want to sell. Now, that can be gamesmanship, but any sale is going to be at an astronomical price. So there's a fair chance he stays at Napoli and tries to build on what they've created this season. Some of it will depend on the player, obviously, and if he gets an opportunity. But make no mistake, the suitors capable of getting Osimhen are going to have to pay an astronomical fee, which rules out a variety of clubs. I think the thing that people forget is that this isn't a signing that has been purchased at a tiny amount. So when people ask me about, let's just say, Moises Caicedo, they quote, why are Brighton being greedy? They paid pennies for the player and they've got a 70 million offer from Arsenal, it was. How can they not sell for that? And fine, you can make that argument. But with Victor Osimhen, Napoli paid a upfront fee of 70 million euros, plus I think 10 million in add-ons. And it wasn't all cash because there was a player trade element, but it was about 55 million euros of cash. And it was an overall package of 80 million euros. So you can understand why they're not going to let a player that's had the season he's had go for 100 million euros and just say, okay, we'll take a 20 million profit on him, but we lose our primary goal scorer. They want double what they paid, which is why we're hearing 140, 150 million euros. It's not in Newcastle's budget. I don't think it will be in Chelsea's budget, but outgoings will be a factor with Chelsea. And Manchester United is still a very real possibility as well. All these clubs are looking at the same players. They're saying, can we get Kane? Can we get Osimhen? Can we get Gonzalo Ramos? Can we get Dusan Vlahovic? And part of the reason why you look at everyone is because there'll be other suitors. And part of the reason is because you don't know how difficult the selling club is going to make it. So it's not a given yet that Osimhen leaves, but I think the player driving a move will be a factor. And he does want Premier League. So I think that Manchester United and Chelsea are two to watch, but don't be surprised if Osimhen ends up doing another season at Napoli. That's not an impossible scenario either.
Okay, we'll finish with this one. Steve says, do you think the owners at Newcastle could potentially let Howe go at some point and go for an elite name? I remember this happening with Hughes. We did discuss this when Howe got the job at Newcastle and he'd been there a few weeks. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, let's say Newcastle next season struggle a little bit and get knocked out of both cups early, don't qualify for Europe. What's your thoughts? Would they go for a Mourinho?
Well, the first thing to say is Howe is an elite name, and he has grown into that title since he's been at Newcastle United. He was known more for being a specialist with working on shoestring budgets, keeping sides up and playing an attractive brand of football. And now he's proven this season that he can step up and take a team out of relegation and into Europe. So we have to call him an elite name. It would be unfair not to. But the challenge for any manager is when you achieve success fast, it becomes the new bar. So it is absolutely true to say that if next season Newcastle have Champions League and then they are in the league whilst playing Champions League, not able to back that up and qualify again and move on, then there will be a feeling that the project has moved in the wrong direction and the manager is always susceptible to potentially losing his job. I think it feels a bit bizarre and preemptive and speculative to be saying, what if Howe, who's done a phenomenal job and will be up there for manager of the year and has got Newcastle Champions League football, doesn't back that up? Is his job under threat? And I think there's always going to be a patience with Howe. But at the end of the day, Howe was not Newcastle's first choice. And it's lucky in many ways that they didn't get their first choice, because look where they are now. But any club that gets Champions League football and wants Champions League football season on season is by default more cutthroat than a club that just wants Premier League survival or is building a bit slower. So that is just the nature of the business, unfortunately. If Newcastle were to ever go a season or two having got Champions League football and decline, then Howe or any manager is under threat. That's the reality. But let's make one thing clear. Howe's job's not under threat because he's Eddie Howe. Howe's job's not under threat because he's not elite. Howe's job's not under threat because Yasser Al-Rumayyan wants a Mourinho or a Spalletti or a Nagelsmann. Quite the opposite. Right now, Newcastle, I think, their owners, their board, would be laughing at any suggestion that they might need a bigger name, that they might be looking elsewhere. That scenario would only ever materialize if results went into decline. And even then, they could be very patient with Howe. And to be second guessing that is ridiculous. You could say that at any club. Like, is Arteta's job under threat if Arsenal finish next season in 6th place? Is Pochettino, who hasn't even joined Chelsea, under threat if Chelsea are in the bottom half next season? Well, of course, the answer is yes. And the reason why is because any big club has higher standards. Any bigger club is more impatient. So it's almost a compliment if people are talking about Howe and Newcastle preemptively, because it tells you that the club are in that conversation where they're not just maybe fighting relegation or looking to consolidate. They're not just talking about long-term, maybe we'll get Europe. They've got where they need to be, but by getting it, the standards raise, the bar raises, the pressure raises. So if anyone's talking about Howe needs Champions League football next season, or he might be under threat, then it's actually a compliment to Newcastle, because it tells you that they've become a big club. They've become a serious contender. But I think that it's entirely disrespectful to Howe to say that he might ever lose his job because the ownership would want a more elite name. Eddie Howe, for me, in qualifying for Champions League football and keeping Newcastle up last season, has become an elite name. Who else would you want at Newcastle United at this stage? Let's see how he handles a bigger squad. Let's see how he handles European football. But the man management, the style of football and the job that he's done is absolutely exceptional. And if Newcastle ever chose to look elsewhere just because they felt like the brand and the club wanted a Mourinho, if that was their approach, it would be a massive own goal, because the chemistry that Newcastle have built, the success that they're moving towards, is all reliant on that tight-knitness, on that chemistry, and Howe's built that, Howe's developed that. And in doing so, as I say, he's become an elite level manager. So if you offered me right now, heading into Champions League football next season, Eddie Howe, continuity, respect from the players, developing a brand, a relatively young manager, of course, still, or Jose Mourinho, all day long I would take Howe, because not only has he earned it and deserved it, but stability is so important in football, and there's absolutely no reason to even think about changing Howe. And the longer he stays at the football club, the more people will realise that he is an elite manager.
Great stuff as always, mate. Fantastic show. That hour always passes very quickly. Thanks to everybody in the chat. Thanks to all the moderators who have joined us as well. I am back 2 o'clock this afternoon with Stu Penman and with Neil Mitchell, the professionals. But for now, Ben Jacobs, take care, mate. See you soon.
All the best. Have a good Sunday, everyone.